What can slavery tell us about capitalism? In this historical moment, when our economy is showing its most destructive face with the genocide in Palestine, more than ever, we need to focus on capitalism. And we are so lucky because we have here with us Professor David McNally, who is Colin Distinguished Professor in Business and History at the University of Houston, who just released a book called Slavery and Capitalism, a New Marxist History. This book is the last of David's intervention to understand the nature and the history of capitalism. Let's start with the liberal narratives about slavery and about capitalism, and how these narratives combined help hide what really matters and miss what we need to focus on more clearly.
That's a great opening. And let me start by congratulating you, Clara, and all your organizers on the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. The meeting we had last night, which was packed, was also charged with energy to understand the world and to change it. And really, my book is meant as a contribution to that project. And you're right, it begins with a central challenge to the liberal narrative of what capitalism is. And that liberal narrative throws up a lot of obstacles to those of us who do want to change the system. So that liberal position in history in particular is really bound up with the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. When that crisis hit now some 15 to 16 years ago, historians in the United States recognized they had no capacity to explain economic events, that they had turned so much to cultural history that political economy escaped them. And so they brought back the study of capitalism. But the problem is, they didn't want to delve into the question of what capitalism is. Some of them even talk about just leaving it as a place marker, the term, without any analysis. The problem with that is that it tends to treat markets and the exchange of commodities as the be-all and end-all of what the system is. And as a result, it depicts most of us as buyers and sellers, people who go to the shopping mall, who go to the grocery store and engage in exchanging money for commodities. And it forgets a hugely important element, the element which is the key to the system, which was at the center of Marx's analysis, which is the market in human labor, or as Marx's technical term, in human labor power. In other words, capitalism depends not primarily on the exchange of goods, because the exchange of goods is not possible without their production. It's the production of goods and services which drives the system, after which they're exchanged. And so, once you think about the production of commodities as being central, then you have to raise some fundamental questions. Who produces them and under what conditions? And what we discover is that the system is a gigantic machinery for exploiting human labor or labor power in the course of producing goods and services in the form of market commodities. Now, when we come to slavery, what we begin to see is that, in fact, over the history of capitalism, there is a range or a spectrum of forms of coercion that accompany the production of commodities. One of the great flaws of the liberal narrative is the idea that free actors enter into exchange with one another. But when you get to the labor market, the market and labor power, you recognize this is not a realm of freedom. This is a realm of unfreedom. We surrender our human rights and our democratic rights when we go to work. We do not have equality with managers. We do not have equality with our employers. We do not have equality with the owners. They have social power over us as their hired hands. And that's a form of coercion. And so with slavery, we simply have critically the most coercive form of binding human laborers to capital, to employers, to managers known as overseers on the plantations. Capitalism is a system of coercing labor. And all I'm really trying to show is that slavery was the most legally and politically coercive form of the domination of human laborers by those who control and run huge business operations. And that's the final point I'll make on this. The plantations of New World slavery, which produced the world's tobacco, sugar, cotton, coffee, indigo, and so on. All of these commodities that fueled the rise of capitalism globally. The plantation was a modern business enterprise. Historians and economists are now recognizing this. They were thoroughly modern capitalist institutions. And within those thoroughly modern capitalist institutions, they had a bonded labor force, a set of working class people who had no legal right to stand up for themselves, to organize themselves, because they were technically owned as commodities. But notice what's happened. We've shifted here from the mere market transactions between goods, which is what the liberal narrative focuses on. I go to the store and I spend money for my coffee. I go to the store and I buy my bread. I go to the landlord and I pay my rent. But rather than that, we've shifted the perspective to that of production and those who produce the world's wealth. And enslaved people were part of that producing class that produced the wealth of capitalism. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, this is also why they had social power, because they were producers and not mere objects.
Thank you, David. This is so important. So you really specify how, from the standpoint of the market, which is the viewpoint of the liberal analysis, the distinction between a wage worker and a slave is absolute. One is, of course, a commodity, the slave. The other supposedly is someone who is free to choose who to work for. On the other hand, you say what matters is really the standpoint of production. And that's where we realize that the same dynamics that occurred in the plantations with the slaves are reproduced, of course, historically in a different specific way, but with the same logic with wage workers. And this is why I would like you to focus more for us about how is this wealth really produced. And I think this is very important because part of the liberal narrative is to tell us actually who matters historically is the investor, is the commodity owner, is the activating force of history is actually the elite that is capable of, innovating and getting us all this wealth that makes us our society so much better than pre-capitalist societies, and how this is ultimately a narrative of linear progress. And instead, what comes out here is that actually wealth is not the outcome of the action of the investor. Rather, it's the outcome of the exploitation of the living labor of the slave or the worker. And thus, the agency has to be understood as not stemming from the elite, but actually stemming from the person who's putting in the living labor. And this is, David, I think crucial because you refer back to the Hegelian analysis of the relation between the master and the slave, saying ultimately the master depends on the slave. And this means that ultimately the autonomy for action and the capacity to break away from this oppression comes from below. So if you can tell us a little bit more about this concept of relative capital, and why is it so important in the analysis of where does wealth come from, where does our supposed progress come from, and how this really tells us a different story about who counts in terms of social transformation.
Right, absolutely. And let's start with your really important insight about the liberal narrative of progress, because fundamentally that's what's being challenged here. In that liberal narrative, the growth of markets means the growth of freedoms. The more markets cover the globe, the more people get to be free agents in buying and selling and market transactions. It's a lovely story. It's a myth. And it projects the idea of complete social harmony. We're all being uplifted by the growth of markets. Now, the irony, of course, is that the vast majority of people know that feels wrong. They don't feel they're being uplifted by the growth of the immense wealth of those who dominate the American economy, say. So when you begin to look at the system from the standpoint of production, that then raises the question of social antagonism and exploitation. And I do try to do a serious deep dive into all the evidence on this for modern or New World slavery. Because what we see from the standpoint of production is that those who own the means of producing wealth, factories, mines, plantations, and so on, they cannot reap any profit without the labor they exploit. And if the workers who are producing all of those commodities got the full value of what they produced, there would be no immense fortunes for Elon Musk. There would be no immense fortunes for Ford or General Motors, Apple, Starbucks, and so on. Their fortunes depend upon exploiting the labor of their workforce and appropriating to their corporate enterprises the surplus value, the value of the unpaid labor of those who work for them. And that means that the system, first off, is antagonistic, not harmonious, as the liberal narrative puts it. It means that it is exploitative, not something that is lifting all boats, as they like to claim. But the other thing that you were describing is that it means that the dominant class is dependent on those who produce the wealth. This is the great secret of all class societies, and especially of capitalist society, that those who produce the wealth actually don't need their employers. They don't need that class. They could continue to produce the world's wealth without a class of exploiters. But the exploiters desperately depend on their labor force. Without them, they are nothing. And that, of course, is a complete inversion of the liberal narrative. As you say, in the liberal narrative, the entrepreneurs and the owning class create the wealth, the culture, and the civilization of our world. In this perspective, seen from below, seen from the standpoint of production, it is the world's workers who produce wealth, culture, and human well-being. They, therefore, have this massive capacity to transform the world. And as we'll talk about, it was the enslaved people who overthrew the slave system. It was not liberals who did it. It wasn't Abraham Lincoln who did it. It was the enormous insurrectionary, self-emancipatory struggles of enslaved people. And I know we'll get to that.
In a minute, we will get to the core of this podcast, which is about the fragility of the slave system and the ultimate fragility of the capitalist system because of the capacity of those who are the producers of this wealth to organize, to take back their space of life that is constantly extracted and taken away from them through capitalist production. But the question here, I think, before that, to really defeat the liberal narrative fully, is to say, well, you know, this system ultimately is the most innovative system of all. And what I want to get to is how you show how already plantations under Atlantic slave were incredibly capitalist in the pressure they had to constantly innovate and integrate markets in order fundamentally to maintain their business alive and beat the competition of potential competitors globally. So it is very interesting to find out that while liberals tells us that the innovation is part of the positive aspects of our economic system, we want to stress how actually innovation is just the best way to get more value out of the oppressed. So could we focus a little bit on what is this compulsion that ultimately hits not just the worker, but also the slave owner to the point that he gets indebted in order to try to keep up and keep exploiting and increasing the rate of exploitation?
Yes, and it's a huge point because, again, with the liberal narrative, there's this elite who are the innovators who are making the world better by expanding its wealth. It's such a nice little dreamy story that they want to tell. But one of the things I'm raising in this book, and all critical political economy and critical history must do, is innovation to what end? And I'm showing that the point of innovation in a capitalist society is to intensify the exploitation of labor. It is to speed up the human body of the worker to perform more and more tasks in less and less time. In other words, it's the efficiency of exploitation which is being increased by innovation. In the slave system, in particular in the south of the United States, we can see the whole series of technologies from the 1790s or so, beginning with so-called Eli Whitney's cotton gin. But really all we're talking about is mechanized processes for cleaning the cotton after it's picked. And what we see is that there is ongoing industrialization of the plantation. The cotton gin is being regularly improved. But to what end? So that by 1860 compared to 1820, the average enslaved cotton worker was picking 4 times as much cotton in the US South as they had been. This had to do with innovations in seeds, biotech. You literally get seeds that produce cotton plants that are more pickable by the human hand. Pickability is how they referred to it. And you create machinery that can clean it more quickly. Then you get innovations in packaging it all up and packing it and compressing it for shipping. But what is the point of all of these so-called improvements? To increase profits. To increase profits by speeding up labor and therefore increasing the surplus labor and the surplus value that these workers are performing. And many, many workers today can tell you that this is the point of technologies. You know, I remember when scanning barcodes came in at grocery stores and people talked about how efficient all of this was. But one of the things they didn't tell you is that the primary purpose of scanning barcodes was to see the number of items that a cashier moved through per minute and to compare every worker and to get rid of the ones who didn't scan as many items. In other words, it was more progress in exploitation. You speed up human labor with these innovations. And so when I say innovation for whom, we're raising the question about the degradation of human labor under capitalism. It's alienation. Very, very rarely are we asking the question, what technologies are making the work process more humane? What are making them easier on the human body? What is uplifting and disalienating the worker in the workplace? Because once we use those metrics and not output per head, for instance, the amount of cotton quadrupling over 40 years per enslaved worker, we start to raise a whole series of questions about the social purposes of production. The social purpose of production in a capitalist society is to increase exploitation, to increase unpaid labor in order to produce the mass fortunes of the ruling class of our society.
Just to make sure we are all on the same page, the idea of unpaid labor under capitalism is fundamentally that a part of the time you work for your boss, you are paying back your wage, fundamentally. What is needed for your life, for your reproduction, what you need for your food, for your rent. But the majority of the time you're working for your boss, actually, what's happening is that it's extra with respect to what you've pocketed. And that is ultimately this unpaid portion of the workday that we see under capitalism, but we were already seeing under slavery, which is, I think, your very important point.
Absolutely. Because if you think about a workday, let's imagine it's an 8-hour workday. The reality is that most of us working for our employer produce goods or services equal to the wages we get to take home in about half of the day. But we don't get to go home after 4 hours. We don't get to say, oh, you know what? I've actually produced for you the value of what you're paying me, so I'm leaving now. No, 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 no. The deal is you must be coerced into continuing to work until the end of the scheduled workday. And all of that unpaid labor time after you've produced the value of your wages is what goes into profit. It's why Marx refers to it as a surplus value over and above the value of your wages. The same thing happened in capitalist slavery. The employing class, the planter class, the master class, they knew the costs that they had to expend for the upkeep of enslaved people. They needed housing, they needed clothing, they needed food, all of these costs, and we know they were accounting for them. We have the records of their account books that show they were precisely measuring the wages in kind as well as the monetary wages that they were paying to enslaved people. And they were tabulating rates of profit or of unpaid labor in exactly the same way. And so that's really at the heart of capitalism. But as we were talking about, it's also why the capitalist depends upon the laborer, and they therefore have a social power that often workers don't appreciate, but very often these enslaved workers did, and they exercised it.
Incredible. One thought before we get to the core here is the liberal narrative of excessive greed. I think this is, again, one of the things we need to debunk. It was not about excessive greed of any specific slave owner who was wanting to beat his slaves more just because he was mean. There is more to this. There is this real competition, this compulsion that ultimately put the slave owners themselves in this precarious situation if they wanted to maintain their business. So this logic, again, of capitalism is a logic that is completely external to any human being. It's detached. It's about investing for more accumulation, which is exactly what the liberals celebrate. This increase of GDP, right? When you take any economic history course, it's very sad because all you see is basically time series with a straight line. And they're like, see, growth is getting bigger and bigger. But this growth is ultimately something that requires the death. Literally, what is very important in your work is that you show how death comes from expropriating time for life. And this is exactly where the slaves were so powerful in reclaiming their time for life. And it was reading your book really gave me the goosebumps because you show really the way in which from their daily activity to more organized forms, it was all about affirming life over death. And so I really think we should really get into this because once we realize that slaves were workers, this is showing us both how both slaves and workers are compelled, but it's also showing us how both slaves and workers are capable of reacting to a social relation that is historical and by definition changeable into a more autonomous and freer direction. So can we explore, David, all the different ways from absenteeism to indiscipline to strikes to escapes to assaults to more organized forms of reaction that showed the life that these slaves were fighting for and bringing forward?
This is so important, Clara, and let's begin with your point about how capitalism essentially involves a political economy of death. If your objective as a system, and you're quite right, this is not simply about the greed of individuals, although they may be greedy. It is about a systemic imperative. These planters had to be able to meet and profit from the world price for cotton, which was being set in London and Manchester. Okay. And they, whether they were producing cotton or sugar or tobacco, they had to meet these world prices. And that imposes upon them this ruthless imperative to exploit labor ever more efficiently. With that, of course, means that you're exploiting human beings whose bodies break down. One of the things people don't like to talk about is that, for instance, in the Industrial Revolution in England, as all of the great textile factories and so on were emerging in Manchester, the average life expectancy of a man in Manchester in the middle of the 19th century in England was 35 years. Life expectancy was falling with the Industrial Revolution because the harder you work the human being to squeeze out unpaid labor, to exploit them, the more you're seizing their life energies for the purpose of capitalism, the more you're squandering their lives. And so the same thing's happening on the plantation with enslaved people. They are counterposing a political economy of life to a political economy of death. They are asserting that life matters. And when you assert that life matters, and the system is driving you to an early death, your only option is to rebel in defense of life. And those rebellions, as you say, took multiple forms. And I tried to show that the most common was absenteeism, literally running away. But in the system of chattel slavery, this meant that you had to withdraw not just your labor, but your body, yourself. You had to disappear into the woods. You had to disappear where someone on a neighboring plantation who might be kin would hide you. So the initial thing, and we know this from planter records, there's always missing or absent enslaved people. They never have a full workforce. Somebody is protesting, okay? And it's driving them crazy. They're doing everything they can, creating slave patrols and so on to stop this, whipping enslaved people when they come back and so on. But the absenteeism doesn't end. When there is an overseer, which is the manager in the field, who is especially punitive and especially coercive, then we often get mass withdrawals of labor. One of the things which is fascinating is to see how often the whole enslaved community could force the firing of an overseer. Because when they all walked out and all of production stopped, all of a sudden, the owner, the planter, had to reckon with the fact that maybe that overseer better be expendable because the workforce isn't going back to work. So they also exercised that capacity to get rid of the most murderous, the most lethal of their overseers. You also see this amazing defense of life when often, because the planters tried to work enslaved pregnant women as late as they could in their terms of pregnancy. And you often get a situation where the community would come to one or two or three young men and they would say, "We need you to run away because we can't get Mary out of the fields unless some of us withdraw our labor." And there's these fascinating stories in some of these records where they, in defense of life, in this case of pregnant women in the fields, young men would run away. And then the workforce would tell the planter, "Oh, they'll return as soon as Mary's allowed to leave the fields," until her child is born, and then she gets X amount of time afterwards. Notice how much time is an issue here. Okay. And the struggle over time is at the center of class struggle in the plantation system. One of the things we find is that over and over again, enslaved people were fighting for shorter hours to their work days and for more days out of the field. Very often in the early stages, the plantation system allowed them maybe a half day or even a full day on Sundays. but they were working 6, more or less 12-hour days. And what we see over time is that they win more and more time away from the fields. In Martinique, they get 2 legal days out of the fields after a series of revolts and uprisings. And they're constantly pressing to expand their time away from work in the fields. And so we have here this classic dynamic of reclaiming time for life. As socialist feminists have said to us, time for social reproduction, for the reproduction of their own lives. And this meant time to work on their own plots of land, time to tend their own gardens, times to worship, times to celebrate, times to simply have social, festive, and familial activities together. Because reproducing ourselves is not a merely material social process. It's also intellectual, spiritual, cultural. It's time to recreate, time for music and dance and song, as well as prayer and so other kinds of social and cultural activities. So they were constantly winning more and more time away from labor. And that's the essence of the human struggle for freedom in capitalist society, to reclaim time for life and its social reproduction. And this is why this resonates so much with Marx. Marx says to us in his most important book, Capital Volume 1, that the victory of the 10-hour bill in England was a victory for, quote, the political economy of labor. They were reducing work hours. No one could be legally forced to work more than 10 hours anymore. The political economy of labor is the political economy of reclaiming time for working class life, for working class human and social development. These enslaved people were doing it, and at their most insurrectionary, they were also organizing general strikes, mass withdrawals of labor, which we may want to come back and talk about this, is a reminder of that huge social power that enslaved people have, just like all laborers do in a capitalist society.
This is incredibly fascinating because it really breaks from the narrative that we get when we go to school, which is that it's actually thanks to Lincoln that slavery was abolished. It's actually thanks to, this human progress and enlightenment towards greater humanity that we kind of got rid of slavery. The story you tell in this book is the opposite. Slavery was abolished because it was economically and politically untenable. And it was untenable not only because ultimately, for example, Britain, and this is very fascinating, Britain started opposing slavery because the British capitalists saw that they couldn't keep up with the competition with for cotton because of the Americans having slaves at their disposal. So there was clearly some pressure from outside, again, for economic interest. But the pressure came from within, from the labor relations, from the fact that it was the slaves saying, we will not give up our life for your pursuit of profit. So this is, to me, fascinating, is how actually liberation came from those who were oppressed.
100%. You see, there was an old myth according to which, by definition, plantations using enslaved labor must become unproductive because it's an inefficient system, allegedly. There's no evidence for this. The evidence is that the plantation system remained highly profitable until its demise. What led to its decline, therefore, was not some pure economic process. It was the growing capacities for resistance and indeed insurgency by enslaved people. It's a fascinating story, and it's something that I try to restore to its centrality in the history of the international working class movement, that the most effective use of the general strike in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, is coming from enslaved people. There's a general strike of about 10,000 enslaved people in Barbados in 1816. There is this amazing Christmas time strike of 30,000 enslaved people in Jamaica, which breaks the back of the slave system in the British colonies. Britain then moves early the next year, in early 1832, to formally abolish slavery in the British colonies. Why? Well, because they'd just seen this immense social power of enslaved people. And as you say, this meant that it was not politically tenable anymore to try to enforce slavery. To do so would have meant massive political and military investments in trying to control this insurrectionary, this insurgent workforce in the fields. And then when we come to the United States case, the myth is that Lincoln freed the slaves, but Lincoln says in 1860 and 1861, it is a lie and a slander that we have any intention to abolish slavery in the slave colonies of the South, in the slave states of the South. This is just a lie, he says. So why does it happen? Well, it happens because, as W.E.B. Du Bois puts it in his great book, Black Reconstruction from 1935, the slaves took matters into their own hands. 500,000 of them fled from the South, withdrew their labor from the Confederacy, found their way to Union lines. And Lincoln's generals are going, what do we do with these people? What's our policy? And initially the policy was return them to their masters. But they refused to go back. They came in such numbers that this wasn't viable. And a few of the more radical Republican generals said, I'm not returning them. They were defying Lincoln, but they were defying Lincoln because enslaved people were forcing the issue. And ultimately, 200,000 of these self-emancipated Black men find their way into the Union Army and Navy. Women serve as cooks and as spies. We often forget that the great Harriet Tubman, who had led a series of raids to free family members and then to free non-kin fugitives, was the most accomplished spy for the Union Army. Lincoln eventually provided a pass which said, Harriet Tubman can go wherever she wants, because the point is, she could provide intelligence to the Union Army that no one else could provide. So this was a movement of self-emancipation. Enslaved people forced emancipation on the Union, on President Lincoln, through their own militancy, their resistance, and their mass flight from the South. So yes, history starts to look very different. And once again, we see the withdrawal of the labor of 500,000 people, both crippled the Confederacy. That's a huge withdrawal of labor power, 500,000 people, and it was adding labor power to the Union military forces. And this is a reminder of where social power lies in our society.
And who are the agents of history? David, so important. You go beyond the surface. You're telling us capital is not a thing, it's a social relation. And once we find out that capital is a social relation, we start understanding that there's nothing spontaneous about capitalism, right? The supposed naturalness of our economic system that the liberal narrative perpetuates falls to the point that we see that the system is actually precarious. And this, I think, is the most emancipatory insight of all, perhaps, in your amazing book, is this whole point of saying the system is fragile. And you learn this by looking at how the agents that were above tried to protect themselves, right? You look at how slave owners tried to protect themselves, but we also see how the law was enforced to protect this capital as a social relation. And in this sense, also how economic policies after the fall of slavery, such as the austerity policies I work on, serve exactly the purpose of maintaining the social relation intact. So before maybe we finish with a comparison between, slave labor and wage labor proper as we know it today, in a way, I would like to maybe focus on the different ways in which governments and states are able to try to preserve capital as a social relation. Again, try to subordinate those who produce the wealth for others. And one important element was, of course, you emancipated yourself as a slave, but this doesn't mean that you had gained your full freedom. And we know, for example, how the convict lease worked to rent out convicts, black convicts that, of course, were imprisoned, to ex-slave owners with the same, actually even worse outcome of beating and killing these convicts to death in order to extract more surplus. So perhaps a reflection about how does the system continue to try to protect capital once slavery is abolished?
Yeah, and by bringing in the law, what you're reminding us, Clara, is that, as you say, there's nothing natural and spontaneous about market relationships. Because market relationships are inherently coercive, it's the economic power of those who own the means of producing wealth up against the power of those who only have their bodies and their spiritual, intellectual, and physical capacities, their labor power to sell. This is an unequal relationship from the start. However, once they find their power in combination, in solidarity with one another, then workers begin to fight back and to resist. And throughout the history of capitalism, what we see is a battery of laws is regularly introduced, intensified, amplified, and extended in order to break the power of resistance of working people. You just have to look at labor laws in the United States to recognize this today. The system is so rigged against workers who try to organize unions, for instance. I mean, it's rigged throughout the global north, but nowhere is it rigged worse than in the United States. So isn't it interesting that the most thoroughly leading capitalist society in the world, the United States, with all of its ostensible freedoms, clamps down on the freedoms of workers to organize more than any other society? There's a relationship between the immense wealth of the ruling class in the United States and the restriction of worker rights. And this runs throughout the history of capitalism. If they can use coercion legally as well as economically, they'll do it. So let's take the convict leasing system that you talk about. Slavery had been destroyed by the self-emancipation of the enslaved people. So what they did was that they brought in a whole series of new laws that created coercive bonded labor once again. Vagrancy laws, quote unquote, which are still on the books in most parts of the United States. If you're found vagrant, you don't have a home, you don't have enough money in your pocket, and so on, you can be thrown into jail for this. And all they did is they took these impoverished, newly legally freed Black people, and they put vagrancy laws in place that if they could find you poor and, quote, unaccounted for, unquote, they could throw you in jail, then they could fine you. Okay, so now you're indebted to government, and then they could say to you, well, you only have one, since you can't pay, you're required to work off this debt, this fine we just imposed upon you for being poor. And this was convict leasing and convict labor. You could either do your convict labor directly for the state, that was widely used in New Orleans, for instance, or you could be leased out to some employer somewhere to work on their farm or in their factory or mine. It was often used in mining, by the way. And of course, while this starts as a form of racial class oppression, it gets extended. In Texas, we now know that half of the workers who were leased out on convict leases were in fact white. So they were taking poor Blacks and poor whites and doing it. But of course, the underlying ideological rationale was how dangerous the Black poor worker was. But then they always extended it. Anybody who thinks that racism is used only against the Black population doesn't understand that it has this equal and wider importance in trying to discipline parts of the non-Black population as well, to essentially say to them, we can do to you too what we are doing to them. Okay? And so the powers of legal coercion are always there. They're always being used. And to imagine a capitalism which is a pure, spontaneous market system is a nonsense. It's a farce. This is one of the things that's just so important about your own work on austerity, because you're showing that austerity is always tied to an authoritarian political project. It is always about the amassing of political and legal power to coerce and subjugate workers. And all I'm really showing in the book is that this includes the slave form of capitalist labor as well. But once we begin to think in those terms, and this is where exactly your work and my work come into conversation, is we realize that all forms of capitalism must be based on subjugating human labor. And in that subjugation, they are going to amass as much coercive and authoritarian power as they can, which is why the struggle for working class rights is always also a struggle for real democracy, for real freedom. Because as the upsurges of enslaved people showed us, the road to freedom lies in the self-emancipation of workers, of laborers. And we have a great historic set of examples in those great resistances of enslaved people. But essentially, they were forging the path to freedom that is still unaccomplished, that is still unrealized. They took immensely important historical steps, but the challenge of freedom lies before us.
David, this is fantastic. Last thoughts before we close. You really show us how governments operate according to this logic of capital that is very rational indeed. The criminalization of the homeless, of the poor that we're seeing today, and we will discuss in our next podcast. The elimination of social benefits, the increase in taxes for workers and detaxing the rich. All of this ultimately helps increase this market dependence, this need to actually go and work for a wage that is so important in order to preserve this economic system that is indeed so fragile. So to end on a positive note, as you just did, is, well, if there's all this effort put through, the law and imprisonment, through economic policies of extraction of social welfare, this means that alternatives are always present. And for me, what is fascinating about your book, and I focus on my research about the alternatives with the factory councils after the First World War and the spreading of this idea of self-management. But what I found so fascinating is to see that slaves themselves had reached a spaces of autonomy in their social reproduction. And so these alternatives to slavery and capitalism were already present and are constantly present. They just need to be kept at bay. So maybe we could finish with some concrete examples of what were these alternatives that were flourishing and that needed to be constantly kept under control in order for capitalism to operate as it does, for profit rather than for need.
Yes, and you see, one of the fascinating things as you go through this history is to realize they were creating alternative social forms. Like all alternative social forms that go against the logic of the dominant society, they are precarious. But we witnessed major maroon colonies of self-emancipated, escaped, enslaved people. They were probably largest and most successful in a place like Jamaica, but there was a whole region throughout the upper south of the United States, sometimes known as the Great Swamp, that had these also self-managing colonies of formerly enslaved people who had withdrawn as maroons, as people who had fled the system. And they self-organize, and they create new forms of communal production based on not on private property rights, but on communal property rights. And they often had to enter into direct, sometimes military conflict with the wider planter society. So much so that in Jamaica, eventually the Maroons and the government sat down and drew up treaties because the government recognized we can't defeat them. So we're going to have to draw up treaties. I think those treaties made more concessions than we would like, but we understand that they posed a threat. They posed an alternative, because every time you create counter spaces within the existing society where we see just the microcosm of alternative ways of organizing social life, this becomes a threat. And this is why Marx said about cooperatives by workers in Britain, look, they can't on their own displace the system, but they can show us a model of a different way of doing things. So it's not the case that creating a bike co-op overturns capitalism. It doesn't. But it reminds us, it fuels our imaginary. It lets us know that another world is possible, that a different way of organizing social life is potentially within reach. It's going to require an anti-systemic transformation to get there. But every time enslaved people broke out of the system and created new communal forms of social life, which they did with regularity, whether it was maroon colonies or during the Civil War in the United States, where they just seized a plantation as the master class fled in fear of the Union Army, for example, and ran that plantation together. Every time they did this, they signaled that capacity. And as we talked about last night, those freedom dreams are crucial, because if you can't dream of another way of organizing social life, then you become immensely demobilized in relation to struggling against it. One of the great things about a project like You're Free is precisely that, fueling the imagination of alternatives, of possibilities. And partly what I'm trying to do by recovering this history is to say to people, enslaved people never took it for granted. They never resigned themselves. They fought always for an alternative form of social life. And we should take great inspiration and great hope from that, because the exploited never give up resistance forever, even if they're defeated for a period of time, which, as you show, austerity did in the early 20th century, culminating in fascism in some cases, or the successes of neoliberalism. They have not buried resistance forever, and our history shows us that.
David, I think these thoughts are more than ever important in a moment in which we are seeing forms of settler colonialism taking the lives of our brothers and sisters in Palestine. And I think the first thing is indeed to defeat the liberal narrative that only remains of the surface of things. And as you show, settler colonialism was at the foundation of the way in which you destroyed alternative communal ways of living in the United States in favor of slave farms and in favor of the financial industrial system and the Industrial Revolution and all that came after. So these stories of struggle never end. And primitive accumulation, the attempt to actually subjugate people, is constant. And I think what we see in Palestine today reminds us that more than ever right now, we need to be prepared to look at the bigger structure, to look at the economic interest, the economic and political interest, because we're saying here that there's nothing economic that is not also political. Last word to you, and then we thank you with all our heart for being with us. Your presence really made such a huge difference in terms of the excitement in that room last night, the fact that everyone felt that through thinking radically, hope is already starting to emerge. And we hope that with the assembly of the forum, we can build on this concretely.
Well, thank you on that, Clara. And yes, let's give our great shout out to the Palestinian people and their heroic resistance in this moment, but also remind ourselves, why are our ruling classes so anti-Palestine? Why are they so committed to the genocide in Gaza? Why do they keep investing in Israeli apartheid and Israeli colonial oppression of Palestinians. It's because they fear resistance, because they know that resistance and victories for the oppressed have a global contagion effect. We are all uplifted and inspired by them. And so, even though you look at that small strip of land on a map of the world that is called Gaza, and you say, why are the powers that be everywhere so invested in this? It is because resistance is so Palestinian today. What they are doing in Palestine is symptomatic of their need to dominate, their need to maintain authoritarian power and authoritarian rule. And that is why, going back to the theme we've been talking about for the last few minutes, the work of our Palestinian comrades and Palestinian artists is so important. I'm reminded here of the wonderful Palestinian performing artist Rafif Ziada, who has her tune and her CD called We Teach Life. And what she's really saying there is the theme that we've been on. The Palestinian people are reaffirming life against the war machines and the death machines. And in doing that, they are the reminder that resistance is possible, that another world is possible, and that it is possible to affirm life against the machineries of death. And that is uplifting and inspiring, and it's why we all owe them as much solidarity as we can.
Thank you, David, for being with us.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you, Clara.